When a man first realizes that you've lost interest, his initial reaction is often disbelief. It's hard for him to come to terms with the fact that things have shifted, especially if he's been accustomed to the dynamic that you once had. He's used to your attention, your affection, your time, and when that suddenly fades, it feels like something has gone wrong, but he might not know exactly what. In these early moments, there's a certain denial that takes over. Denial because the realization is too painful to accept. Instead of facing the truth, he might convince himself that it's just a temporary phase, that you're simply going through something and will come back around. He might even justify your distance, telling himself that you're busy or distracted by other things, without acknowledging that your feelings toward him have truly changed. What's important here is that during this phase, he won't necessarily confront you directly. He'll likely keep pretending everything is fine, even as his inner world begins to spiral. He doesn't want to face the discomfort of seeing the relationship for what it truly is now. And so he hides behind this layer of denial, not fully accepting the reality of the situation. It's easier to keep things in the past where he feels secure, rather than acknowledge the painful truth of the present. This stage can last for a while, especially if he's had strong feelings for you. He might avoid addressing the issue directly because deep down, he fears losing you completely. Instead, he may opt to keep things the way they were, pretending that nothing has changed. This initial denial is his way of protecting himself from the hurt of facing the truth. He doesn't want to lose what he had, and so he clings to the hope that things will somehow go back to normal. But deep down, the change is already there, and eventually, even he can't deny it forever. The truth will hit him, but for now, he's still living in that space of uncertainty, and it's only when this denial phase breaks down that he'll begin to move into the next emotional stage. This is a process that plays out in many relationships, and it's one of the first signs that something is shifting, whether he's ready to admit it or not. The more you pull away, the harder it will be for him to deny. Eventually, the truth will come to the surface. But for now, he's still caught in the hope that everything will somehow return to the way it was. Once the initial denial begins to fade, the next phase is often a feeling of confusion. A man may start to wonder what went wrong and begin questioning everything he thought he knew about the relationship. He may replay conversations, moments of connection, and interactions in his mind, looking for clues about what changed. The problem is he may not have seen the signs that your feelings were slipping away, or he may have ignored them altogether, not fully understanding the depth of your emotional distance. In this phase, he may begin to feel a sense of helplessness. He doesn't know how to fix what he doesn't fully understand. If he didn't pick up on the subtle hints of your shifting emotions, it can be jarring for him to process. He may even feel like he's been blindsided, as if the change came out of nowhere, leaving him scrambling for answers. And while he's trying to piece everything together, he might reach out more frequently, perhaps asking what went wrong, or trying to subtly test the waters by acting as though nothing has changed. The confusion sets in when he's unsure about the reasons behind your disinterest. Is it something he did? Did something happen between you two? Or is it something internal to you that he can't possibly know or control? These questions can weigh heavily on his mind, leading to self-doubt. He might start wondering if he wasn't enough for you, questioning his own value and worth in the relationship. In some cases, this confusion may manifest as frustration. He may try to fix things by doing more, by being more attentive, more available, or even trying to assert his presence more forcefully. Unfortunately, this attempt to solve the problem by pushing harder often has the opposite effect. It can make things feel even more strained because he hasn't fully grasped that the solution isn't about doing more, it's about addressing the deeper emotional distance that has grown between you two. This stage can be particularly difficult for him because it involves a lot of internal conflict. He wants to figure out what went wrong, but he's unsure where to start. The longer this confusion lasts, the harder it becomes for him to hold on to hope. And in many cases, when confusion isn't resolved, it shifts into frustration, resentment, or even anger. But before he gets to that point, he has to face the discomfort of not knowing how or why things fell apart. Ultimately, confusion is a natural part of the process. It's his mind trying to make sense of something that shifted and, in a way, a form of him wrestling with the truth that he might not be ready to accept yet. The key here is that his desire to understand the situation shows he still cares, but he's lost in a maze of questions without clear answers. As the confusion starts to fade, the next reaction that typically emerges is regret. This phase is where he begins to reflect on the moments that led up to your emotional withdrawal, and he starts to feel a deep sense of remorse for not recognizing the signs sooner. Regret is powerful because it makes him question his actions or inactions and wonder if he could have done things differently. He starts thinking about what he might have missed or the opportunities where he could have shown more effort, care, or attention to your needs. This is when he may begin to blame himself, revisiting moments where he could have acted differently or had a conversation with you before things escalated. There's a real sense of vulnerability that comes with regret. He realizes he may have taken you for granted or failed to nurture the connection as he should have. It's painful for him to think that his lack of attention or missteps could have been the reason you pulled away, and the idea that he's responsible for the breakdown of something that was once meaningful can be crushing. In this stage, he might start to second-guess the things he said or did. Perhaps he was too caught up in his own life, or maybe he didn't communicate his feelings well enough. Whatever the case, regret often leads him to a place where he feels like he's lost something valuable, and now there's no clear way to get it back. He might even try to win you over in subtle ways, perhaps through small gestures or conversations. But these attempts may come across as too little, too late. The real challenge here is that regret doesn't just make him wish for a do-overs. It makes him aware that he is in a position where he can't fix the past. The emotional disconnect that has developed might feel like a chasm that's too wide for him to cross. This realization often intensifies the feelings of guilt and inadequacy. The more he wishes he could go back and make things right, the more he begins to feel like it's out of his control. And that's a tough pill to swallow. He might also experience frustration alongside the regret, because even though he realizes what went wrong, he doesn't always know how to fix it. This is where a deeper sense of helplessness begins to creep in. He's confronted with the fact that he's unable to turn back time, and the pain of knowing he's caused this situation makes it difficult to move forward. But regret, while difficult, is also a necessary stage in understanding what went wrong and why things ended up where they are. It's an opportunity for growth and self-awareness, and it's a key step in the process of realizing the value of the connection that was lost. As the regret settles in, he begins to feel the sting of vulnerability. Vulnerability isn't something that many men are comfortable with. It's not easy to admit that they might have missed out on something significant or that they're not in control of the situation anymore. But when he realizes you've lost interest, he starts to feel exposed. This is a place where pride often clashes with genuine emotion. For the first time, he's faced with the fact that he may have pushed you away or taken you for granted, and that realization can make him feel extremely vulnerable. In many ways, men are conditioned to be stoic, to appear strong and invulnerable, but when a relationship starts slipping away, these layers of defense begin to peel away. He can no longer hide behind excuses or pretend that everything is fine. Deep down, he knows the situation is different now. The loss of your attention or affection cuts deep, and he's forced to confront the possibility that he might not have been as emotionally available or invested as he should have been. This is where his internal dialogue becomes a battleground. He might ask himself why he didn't notice the signs earlier, why he didn't prioritize you the way you needed, or why he didn't make more of an effort to keep the connection alive. Vulnerability surfaces because in these moments, he feels like he's lost his grip on something that was important to him, and that feeling is far from comfortable. As he faces this vulnerability, it may bring up feelings of inadequacy. He may start questioning his worth, wondering if he's the kind of person you could ever rely on or if he's deserving of another chance. It's a humbling experience for him, one that forces him to acknowledge his own flaws and shortcomings. And in many cases, this realization comes with a profound sense of helplessness. He can't change what's already happened, and now he has to deal with the consequences of his actions. What makes this stage even more complex is that it often triggers a need for validation. As his vulnerability grows, he might try to reach out to you, hoping that you'll reassure him, or he might seek comfort from others in an attempt to fill the emotional void left by the loss of your attention. But here's the catch. Vulnerability doesn't always lead to resolution. It can leave him in a limbo state where he's unsure of how to move forward, especially if you've already emotionally checked out. This is a critical turning point in the emotional journey, he may think, raw and exposed, realizing that his actions have led him to this place, and yet this stage holds the potential for growth and understanding. Because when vulnerability is acknowledged and processed, it can become a catalyst for change. It's not just about losing interest. It's about coming to terms with the fact that he now sees things in a way he didn't before, and that shift in perspective is profound. When he realizes you've lost interest, the next phase is often marked by self-doubt. It's as if the very foundation of his self-worth begins to tremble. Men often attach their value to how others perceive them, and when they sense someone they care about slipping away, they begin to question if they're enough. This self-doubt isn't just about the relationship. It can start to seep into every aspect of his life, his confidence, his ability to connect with others, and even his own sense of purpose. It's an unsettling feeling, one that forces him to confront aspects of himself he might have ignored or overlooked. He starts wondering whether he's been too distant or too focused on other aspects of life, leaving little room for the relationship to flourish. The realization that he's let something valuable slip through his fingers brings about a harsh self-reflection, and often that reflection isn't kind. This is the point where he might ask himself tough questions. Am I not good enough? Did I miss something? Why didn't I see this coming? These questions don't just arise from insecurity, they come from a place of guilt. He knows he could have done better, been more present, more attentive, but now it feels too late to make amends. There's an overwhelming sense of regret that starts to creep in, and this regret can be paralyzing. This last point creates a feeling of despair and lack of purpose, and goes on for decades to take over his life. The regret can keep paralyzing. For many men, this self-doubt is deeply uncomfortable. It challenges the self-perceived they've built over time, making them face parts of themselves that they would rather avoid. It's easier to brush off weaknesses or imperfections, but when faced with the reality that someone has pulled away, those walls begin to crack. He can no longer deny that his actions or inactions have consequences. This stage often leads to a sense of helplessness, as he doesn't know how to fix the situation or undo the emotional distance that has grown between you. He might feel as though he's lost control, that no matter how hard he tries, he can't change the way you feel, and that's a hard pill to swallow. At this point, the only way forward is through growth. Self-doubt can either paralyze him or motivate him to reflect on what went wrong and take responsibility for it. It may not be easy, but the truth is that real growth often comes from these uncomfortable moments. This is where he can either stay stuck in his own self-criticism or take the necessary steps to change, both in the way he approaches relationships and in the way he views himself. It's a crucial turning point, one that can lead to a better understanding of how to build healthier, more fulfilling connections in the future. When he realizes you've lost interest, the next phase he often enters is one of confusion and frustration. This can manifest in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's a passive-aggressive behavior. Other times it's a more direct form of questioning or attempting to regain control. He becomes perplexed about what went wrong, and while he might have been dismissive or too comfortable in the relationship, now he can't help but feel like he's lost a connection that he didn't think would slip away. This confusion often comes from a place of not truly understanding how he could have overlooked the signs of your fading interests. Men, like anyone, seek validation in relationships. And when that validation starts to dwindle, it can create a deep sense of insecurity. It's like trying to hold on to something slipping through your fingers, but not fully grasping what went wrong in the first place. The frustration emerges because he's caught between wanting to fix things and feeling helpless because it feels like you're pulling away no matter what he does. He may try to chase or win back your attention, but often this comes off as either too desperate or, ironically, too indifferent, both of which can push you even further away. The more he attempts to fix things, the more it may seem like he's not respecting the boundaries that you've set, and that can lead to further emotional distance. There's also a struggle within him between wanting to maintain control of the situation and realizing that he can no longer dictate the outcome. That's where the confusion starts to cloud his thinking. In the past, he might have been accustomed to a certain level of predictability, knowing what would keep the relationship alive. But now your distance is a reminder that relationships aren't meant to be controlled or manipulated. They require mutual respect, effort, and emotional investment. When he begins to understand that his efforts to regain your interests may be falling short, frustration sets in. He can't simply turn the dial and expect things to be the same again. That realization stirs a storm inside. He wants things to go back to normal, to find his footing again. But the truth is, it's no longer within his grasp in the same way it was before. The frustration isn't just about the relationship itself, it's about his inability to fix it on his own terms. In this space, he has no choice but to reflect on himself, on his past actions, and on the dynamic that shifted between you two. It's an uncomfortable place to be, but sometimes it's in that discomfort that real change begins to take root. In this emotional fog, the confusion and frustration may make him realize that this isn't just about getting your attention back. It's about becoming more self-aware, learning to let go, and understanding that the relationship is a reflection of two people's investment in each other. The key takeaway from this stage is that his sense of frustration, though uncomfortable, is a necessary part of growth, both for him and for the relationship. Ultimately, this realization can serve as a catalyst for change, where he finds the clarity needed to either let go gracefully or work on rebuilding a stronger, more genuine connection with you. When he realizes you've lost interest, one of the most significant shifts he may experience is a profound sense of self-doubt. This self-doubt often manifests in questioning his worth, his actions, and whether or not he was ever good enough for you in the first place. It's not always obvious, but internally, this can create a whirlwind of negative thoughts. He begins to wonder if it was something he did, or worse, if he is inherently unlovable or incapable of sustaining a meaningful connection. This self-doubt can lead him to either become overly self-reflective or, conversely, to shut down emotionally. On one hand, he might try to analyze every conversation, every moment, trying to pinpoint the exact moment you started pulling away. He'll replay interactions, looking for any signs that might explain what went wrong. On the other hand, if the self-doubt is too overwhelming, he may close himself off, refusing to acknowledge the pain of losing your attention or affection or affectivity. The important thing to understand here is that this isn't a conscious act. It's a defense mechanism triggered by the fear of being inadequate. The loss of interest from someone he cared about can feel like a rejection of not just the relationship, but of him as a person. In many cases, this self-doubt can linger long after the relationship has ended. It's that nagging voice in his head telling him that he couldn't measure up, that maybe he wasn't enough, and that's why you stepped away. Who taught you better than that? The other reason to deal with the given moment of sadness is the passing of a loved one. This feeling of inadequacy can also cause him to second-guess his own value and the way he shows love or affection. He starts to wonder if he could have done something differently, if there were little things he missed or big things he failed to see. In some cases, this could push him to work harder on himself. He might try to fix what he perceives as flaws in his character or personality, hoping that it will somehow bring you back or make him more desirable in the future. However, these efforts are often misguided because the real work lies in addressing his own self-worth, not just becoming someone he thinks others would like. Ultimately, the self-doubt that arises in response to your loss of interest is part of the emotional reckoning that can lead to growth or to deeper insecurity. It's a critical moment for him to realize that the external validation he seeks doesn't define his worth. It's about self-acceptance and growth. If he chooses to learn from this experience, he might emerge with a stronger sense of self, but if the self-doubt continues unchecked, it could lead to even more emotional distance, both from you and from his own sense of identity. At the core of this self-doubt is the opportunity for introspection. If he allows himself to process this moment rather than avoid it, he can transform the negative feelings into an opportunity to grow. Learning that self-worth doesn't depend on another person's validation. It's in this understanding that he can move beyond the feelings of inadequacy and eventually rebuild a sense of confidence in himself. When he realizes you've lost interest, one of the common reactions is that he may begin to pull away emotionally. This emotional withdrawal is often his way of protecting himself from further hurt. It's as if he's guarding his heart, preparing for the inevitable disappointment of the relationship fading away. At first, it might look like indifference or apathy, but behind this behavior is a man who is retreating from the fear of vulnerability, tutoring in his daughter's music lessons, lost in her room, sometimes trapped in his own wrinkles. And secondly, he may begin to recycle behaviors that reflect his own wound. He might stop being as responsive or available, trying to keep his emotions in check. He might seem distant, or perhaps more closed off than usual. This withdrawal is often a defense mechanism. It's his way of coping with the realization that your connection is slipping away. He may feel like the closer he gets emotionally, the more painful the inevitable rejection will be. So, in a way, he chooses to distance himself before he can get hurt even more. This withdrawal can also stem from a lack of understanding about how to deal with rejection. For many men, the idea of rejection, especially when it comes from someone they've invested time and emotion in, can be overwhelming. It can make them feel vulnerable and exposed, as though they've failed in some way. The emotional distance they create can be an attempt to regain control over a situation where they feel powerless. They might convince themselves that by emotionally distancing themselves, they're protecting their pride or avoiding further humiliation. However, this emotional withdrawal doesn't always mean he no longer cares. It often signifies that he cares too much and doesn't know how to handle the loss. He might start suppressing his feelings, convincing himself that detachment is the only way to avoid the pain of a deeper emotional investment. The harder it becomes to confront the reality of your fading interest, the more he may focus on shutting himself down emotionally, convincing himself that he's fine, even if that's far from the truth. It's important to note that this emotional withdrawal can also be a sign of a deeper insecurity. When someone pulls away like this, it's usually because they've been hurt before or are afraid of being hurt again. The fear of emotional exposure becomes so overwhelming that the easiest option for him is to disconnect. He might not know how to express the hurt he's feeling, so he resorts to this quiet retreat, keeping his thoughts and emotions to himself. But over time, this emotional withdrawal can lead to a breakdown in communication and a sense of detachment that can be hard to repair. The more he pulls away, the more the gap between you two grows. What started as a defense mechanism can slowly become a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the emotional distance causes more disconnect, leaving both of you feeling alienated from each other. Ultimately, his emotional withdrawal is a sign of his own internal struggle. It's an emotional coping mechanism, but it can also be an opportunity for both of you to understand the dynamics of vulnerability, communication, and the impact of emotional needs in a relationship. If he realizes the power of vulnerability and openness, he may eventually move beyond this withdrawal. But if he continues to suppress his feelings, the emotional gap will only grow wider, leaving the relationship unable to recover. When a man realizes you've lost interest, he may begin to focus more on his own personal growth and well-being. This shift often happens as a response to the realization that the relationship isn't fulfilling his emotional needs anymore. He might suddenly become more invested in his career, hobbies, or social life, almost as if he's redirecting his energy away from you and putting it into himself. This isn't necessarily a sign that he's given up or doesn't care about you. Instead, it's a sign of him seeking validation and purpose outside of the relationship. At first, this change might be subtle, but over time, it can become more noticeable. He may start taking better care of himself, both physically and mentally. He might hit the gym, focus on his personal goals, or begin to nurture friendships that had taken a back seat while he was involved with you. These activities may be his way of filling the emotional void left by the fading connection. When someone feels disconnected from another person, it's common for them to shift their attention towards self-improvement, almost as if they're trying to find a way to regain control over their life and feel good about themselves again. This personal growth can also come as a form of self-preservation. If a man has invested emotionally in a relationship where he feels his feelings are no longer reciprocated, he may have to rebuild his confidence. Focusing on himself allows him to create a sense of self-worth independent of the relationship. It's a way of reminding himself that he has value, even if the connection with you has faded. By reconnecting with his own desires and goals, he's building the emotional resilience necessary to move forward. However, this doesn't mean that he's not affected by the situation. In fact, sometimes focusing on self-growth is his way of coping with the emotional pain of realizing that you've lost interest. When people are hurt, especially in a relationship, they often take refuge in things they can control, like their own personal development. It's easier to focus on something concrete, something that gives them a sense of accomplishment, rather than confronting the emotional turmoil of losing someone they care about. Over time, he might start to feel like he's rediscovered his purpose outside of the relationship. This can be empowering for him. It can make him feel more confident and in some cases more attractive to you as well. When he's focusing on bettering himself, he's not just dealing with the pain of losing you, but also using it as a catalyst for self-improvement. His personal growth might even bring out qualities in him that you find more appealing, qualities you may have admired when you first met him. But if this shift happens without any real communication or closure between the two of you, it could be a sign that he's trying to emotionally detach and move on. He may no longer feel the need to chase after you or try to win you back because he's redirected his focus to himself. This is where the emotional distance becomes more permanent, as his journey of personal growth continues and your place in his life diminishes. In the end, his focus on personal growth after realizing you've lost interest can be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's healthy for him to improve himself and move forward. But on the other hand, it could be a sign that he's emotionally shifting away and coming to terms with the fact that the relationship is no longer a priority for him. The key here is understanding that this shift isn't a rejection of you, but rather a way for him to cope, heal, and find himself again. How you respond to this change can ultimately determine if there's a possibility of rekindling what was lost or if it marks the end of your connection. When a man realizes you've lost interest, he may start to distance himself emotionally. This emotional detachment isn't always immediate or obvious. It often happens gradually. He may stop initiating conversations, taking longer to respond, or even withdrawing from situations where you would typically interact. At first, it might seem like he's just busy or maybe he's going through something personal, but deeper down, this behavior usually signifies something more profound. He's sensing that the emotional connection is no longer there. This shift can happen for a variety of reasons, the most common one being that he's picking up on subtle cues that you're no longer invested, whether it's through your actions, your tone, or even the absence of communication from your side. When he senses this emotional distance, his instinct might be to protect himself from further hurt or rejection. It's as if he's slowly pulling back, trying not to invest too much emotionally because he recognizes that you're no longer fully engaged. As he begins to detach emotionally, he might begin to show less enthusiasm when he does communicate with you. His responses may become more short or indifferent, and his body language might seem closed off or distant. He may no longer put in the effort he once did to make you feel special, and this emotional withdrawal can leave you feeling confused or even rejected. It's important to realize that this is often his way of adjusting to a reality he's unwilling to fully face, that the connection between the two of you is no longer as strong as it once was. What makes this emotional detachment more complicated is that it doesn't always happen because he no longer cares about you. In fact, it's often a sign that he still has feelings, but he's protecting himself from the emotional pain of seeing that you've pulled away. The less he feels emotionally invested, the less hurt he will endure when the realization hits that you no longer feel the same way. In this sense, emotional detachment can act as a defense mechanism, a way for him to guard against the vulnerability of loving someone who no longer reciprocates those feelings. Over time, if this emotional distance continues to grow, he might even begin to convince himself that he's better off focusing on other aspects of his life. He may pour himself into work, friendships, or hobbies, and in doing so, he may inadvertently solidify the distance between you two. It's as though he's closing the door on any possibility of rekindling the connection because he's already emotionally preparing himself for the end. The longer this emotional detachment continues, the harder it becomes to bridge the gap that is formed between the two of you. At this stage, it's crucial to recognize that he might no longer see the relationship as something worth pursuing if the emotional connection is no longer there. This detachment could be a sign that he's coming to terms with the idea that it's time to move on. While this doesn't mean that he's completely forgotten about you or stopped caring, it does mean that he's starting to emotionally detach and process the situation from a distance. If you're still interested in maintaining or reviving the connection, it will require effort on both sides. It's important to understand that for him to fully re-engage, he will need to feel that emotional connection once more, and that's something that takes time, understanding, and mutual effort. Ultimately, emotional detachment can signal that he's gradually moving on, and while it's painful, it's also a necessary part of healing for both people involved. Whether this detachment leads to a final goodbye or gives both of you the space to grow and rediscover your emotional connection depends on how you both handle the situation moving forward. The key is to recognize the signs of emotional distance and understand that it's often a result of deeper emotional needs that have gone unmet, signaling that the relationship may have reached a natural conclusion.